If we lay on the table religion, communism, Nazism, they are all unifying ethos. They're unifying ideas, but they're also horribly dividing ideas. They both unify and divide. Religion has also divided people.
Yeah.
Because in the nuances of how the different peoples wrestle with God, they have come to different conclusions, and then they use those conclusions, or perhaps the people in power use those conclusions to then start wars, to start hatred, to divide.
Yeah, well, it's one of the key sub-themes in the Gospels is the sub-theme of the Pharisees. And so the fundamental enemies of Christ in the Gospels are the Pharisees and the scribes and the lawyers. So what does that mean? The Pharisees are religious hypocrites. The scribes are academics who worship their own intellect. And the lawyers are the legal minds who use the law as a weapon. And so they're the enemy of the Redeemer. That's a subplot in the gospel stories. And that actually all means something. The Pharisaic problem is that the best of all possible ideas can be used by the worst actors in the worst possible way. And maybe this is an existential conundrum, is that the most evil people use the best possible ideas to the worst possible ends. And then you have the conundrum of how do you separate out, let's say, the genuine religious people from those who use the religious enterprise only for their own machinations. We're seeing this happen online. Like, one of the things that you're seeing happening online, I'm sure you've noticed this, especially on the right-wing psychopathic troll side of the distribution, is the weaponization of a certain form of Christian ideation. And that's often marked, at least online, by the presence of, what would you say, cliches like Christ is king, which has a certain religious meaning, but a completely different meaning in this sphere of emerging right-wing pathology. Right-wing. The political dimension isn't the right dimension of analysis, but it's definitely the case that the best possible ideas can be used for the worst possible purposes. And that also brings up another specter, which is like, well, is there any reliable and valid way of distinguishing truly beneficial unifying ideas from those that are pathological? And so that's another thing that I tried to detail out in these lectures, but also in this new book. It's like, how do you tell the good actors from the bad actors at the most fundamental level of analysis?
And good ideas from the bad ideas, and you lecture on truth that Nietzsche also struggled with. So how do you know that communism is a bad idea versus it's a good idea implemented by bad actors?
Right. That's a more subtle variant of the religious problem, and that's what the communists say all the time. The modern day communists are like, real communism has never been tried. And you could say, I suppose, with some justification, you could say that real Christianity has never been tried because we always fall short of the ideal mark. And so, I mean, my rejoinder to the communists is something like, every single time it's been implemented, wherever it's been implemented, regardless of the culture and the background of the people who've implemented it, it's had exactly the same catastrophic consequences. It's like, I don't know how many examples you need of that, but I believe we've generated sufficient examples so that that case is basically resolved. Now, the general rejoinder to that is, it's really something like, well, if I was in charge of the communist enterprise, the utopia would have come about. Right. But that's also a form of dangerous pretense. Part of the way, see, that problem is actually resolved to some degree in the developing notion of sacrifice that emerges in the Western canon over thousands and thousands of years. So one of the suggestions, for example, and this is something exemplified in the Passion story, is that you can tell the valid holder of an idea because that holder will take the responsibility for the consequences of his idea onto himself. And that's why, for example, you see one way of conceptualizing Christ in the gospel story is as the ultimate sacrifice to God. So you might ask, well, what's the ultimate sacrifice? And there are variants of an answer to that. One form of ultimate sacrifice is the sacrifice of a child, the offering of a child, and the other is the offering of the self. And the story of Christ brings both of those together because he's the Son of God that's offered to God. And so it's an archetypal resolution of that tension between ultimate sacrifice. Ultimate because once you're a parent, most parents would rather sacrifice themselves than their children, right? So you have something that becomes of even more value than yourself. But the sacrifice of self is also a very high order level of sacrifice. Christ is an archetype of the pattern of being that's predicated on the decision to offer everything up to the highest value, right? That pattern of self-sacrifice. And I think part of the reason that's valid is because the person who undertakes to do that pays the price themselves. It's not externalized. They're not trying to change anyone else, except maybe by example. It's your problem. And that, like Solzhenitsyn pointed that out too, when he was struggling with the idea of good versus evil. And you see this in more sophisticated literature. You know, in really unsophisticated literature or drama, there's a good guy and the bad guy. And the good guy's all good. And the bad guy's all bad. And in more sophisticated literature, the good and bad are abstracted. You can think of them as spirits. And then those spirits possess all the characters in the complex drama to a greater or lesser degree. And that battle is fought out both socially and internally. In the high order religious conceptualizations in the West, if they culminate, let's say, in the Christian story, the notion is that battle between good and evil is fundamentally played out as an internal drama.
Yeah, so for a religious ethos, the battle between good and evil is fought within each individual human heart.
Right. It's your moral duty to constrain evil within yourself. And well, there's more to it than that, because there's also the insistence that if you do that, that makes you the most effective possible, like, warrior, let's say, against evil itself in the social world. That you start with the battle that occurs within you, in the soul, let's say. The soul becomes the battleground between the forces of good and evil. The idea that there's an idea there too, which is if that battle is undertaken successfully, then it doesn't have to be played out in the social world as actual conflict, right? You can rectify the conflict internally without it having to be played out as fate, as Jung put it.